Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. You hear me? Yes. Thank you, Fredrik. I don't think I've ever had my name in such big type before, so thank you especially for that. That's a big welcome. Most of my life I worked in publishing with major European publishing groups like Bonniers, Hachette, Sanoma in Finland, and for a period with Första from Canada. And the last 20 years I've been involved in the taxpayers movement, first, as Fredrik said, with the Swedish Taxpayers Organization, and then since I retired with the international movement, taxpayers movement. I've been the chairman the last 2 years and retired from that a month ago. So that's a bit on my background. It seems to me that we have two themes, at least for the first part of our discussion, or perhaps they are intertwined, so we have to talk about the death of the EU and the harmonization of tax havens. The first topic of death and taxes is simple. To tax a person after he is dead might seem more humane than taxing him while he is alive. But it will have him or her worried and planning to minimize the effect for his family or causes long before. So let me be frank. Estate or inheritance taxes are based on some kind of socialist attempt to even out the outcome of life's long efforts when all is said and done. And somehow it does not seem quite fair, and it is also very impractical. Let me give you the Swedish example and my personal example. In the early 90s, my parents wanted to arrange that we 4 children could keep the family summer house in the archipelago after their demise. They did what most did in those days to avoid the gift or estate tax. They signed the house over to us, but not just like that. In return, they got 10 debt notices from each of us. Each debt notice was for the value of the limit you could give as a gift each year. So over 10 years, every Christmas, my parents gave us back one of these 10 notes. So after 10 years, we had no longer a debt to our parents for the house, and we had paid no gift or inheritance tax on the summer house. This was the way a lot of people did it. For larger estates, you could use a more complicated method. You bought an apartment house. The tax value was maybe 30% less than the value of the house. So you borrowed 70%, and you gave it to your children, and you renovated it so to increase the value of it. So in this way, you could transfer millions of kroner to the next generation. Then suddenly, in the autumn of 2004, the Swedish socialist government, out of the blue, decided to abolish the estate tax altogether. Everyone was surprised, but the reasons were quite good, actually. The tax receipts were very small, 0.2% of the total taxes they took in. They could quite easily be avoided, as I mentioned in my example. They were paid, and the tax was paid mainly by middle-class homeowners, farmers, and small businesses that then had a difficulty in transferring the business to the next generation. So, and we also had a very publicized case where one of the big inheritors of the Astra pharmaceutical company had an estate tax and a profit tax on the shares when they were sold, and the shares dropped in between. So instead of receiving a number of 100 million kroner, the inheritance were left with a debt of 150 million kroner. And that was not the way they did eventually something to even this out, but from the very big wealth, it was all gone. There are also, as everyone knows, who have had, I was going to say, who has ever died, you know, it's quite expensive in other ways. And other costs to be paid when you die. So many of us wish we could avoid it altogether, but anyway, that's another question for the medical industry. So anyway, so when my parents eventually died at the age of 90 plus, the process was quite quick and simple. We sold the apartment they had for about 35 years, and we had to pay about 22% tax on the profits and on the value increase, and then we divided the money between the 4 of us. So that was quick and simple. And in the wake of the abolishment of the tax of the estate tax in Sweden, life has become easier for small businesses and farmers, families with some savings, and wealthy people like IKEA founder Ingvar Kamprad has returned to Sweden, and some international business people like the chairman of Nordea, Björn Wahlroos, have moved to Sweden, especially as the wealth tax now also is abolished. Last year we had these two taxes combined. They accounted for about 0.6% of all the taxes received in Sweden. And the wealth tax had also been fiddled with the government because they wanted people like the H&M owners to stay in Sweden. So if you were a major owner of a big company, your wealth was tax exempt. So it was not very democratic in that ways. But our social democratic government was forward-looking, and this has been part, I think, of the good growth in the liberal development of the Swedish economy. So now I want to just show you a few quick slides of the situation around the world, where we are on this particular slide. Whoops, there we are. Anyway, this is hard to read. Just to show you that, good, that's better. This is the top inheritance estate tax around the world. United States at 40%. And going on down. These are the 19 of the OECD countries that still have this tax. Greece 20, Netherlands, Finland 19, Denmark 15, and so on. Let's see, I can do this myself. 13 countries have repealed inheritance or estate tax since 2000. Sweden in 2005, it says, but it was actually, we had the tsunami, and the government moved the date back to December 17, so the hundreds of people who died in the tsunami would not be affected by the estate tax. And going on down, yes. So in these countries, there is no estate or inheritance tax. Luxembourg, Serbia, Slovenia, Austria, Canada, Norway, and so on. This is just, I won't get into this, but it's an American calculation of how much the GNP would grow, 0.8%, they said, if the estate tax was abolished. The thing with the US is that the exemption is very high. In Sweden, the exemption was very low, which my example with the summer house showed. It were just a few $1,000s. Here, this shows that Obama has done something for the rich people in America, increasing the level here. It was no estate tax, it was repealed in 2010, and then it's been moved up to, so you only pay it over $5 million. And that means that per year now in America, you have about 3,000 estates that actually pay the estate tax. They differ between the estate taxes paid by the estate and the inheritance tax by the people who get the money or the wealth. So, but a lot of thousands and others in America plan for the estate, of course, and keep a lot of lawyers busy. Okay, in other countries it's also quite high, like France is $105,000, Germany about $400,000, and so on. So that's a little bit about the inheritance tax, and I will move on to the next topic, tax planning and inheritance tax. And first let me say that tax planning is not only legitimate, but a necessity and the duty of the financial management of a company. It is simply their job to minimize these costs, as other costs are reviewed and minimized. I've been an internal controller myself in one of the companies that I worked with. This leads to a number of decisions where you have to use judgment, examine the rules, and in total have a consensus within the company management as to how you want the company run. To me, now I'm getting into some personal comment, but to me it's astonishing that internationally, from one part of an international company to another, very high interest rates have been used and have been allowed to be used. We are here talking maybe even 13% interest rate on a Swedish company here who's quite profitable, going to a finance company in Luxembourg, for instance. And these sort of transactions are often not even necessary. But it's been used a lot and is still being used. It's been criticized a lot too. Then we have the issue, which is not quite as obvious, of internal pricing, which is an even more difficult and complex issue. So the question of internal royalties, of products being sold across the borders, and so on. And in this area, this is a very large gray area which is not being discussed very much. But here also, of course, you can minimize your taxes. This leads to the taxation authorities to try to harmonize taxes more and more to avoid these kinds of tax plannings, especially across Europe. And in general, the attitude of society is positive towards business and entrepreneurship these days. It was different in the 70s and part of the 80s, when the growth of the public sector was thought to be the secure and good future for all. And now we see the results of that. Lately, the tax havens in general, and Panama in particular, have been making the news. There are probably many legitimate reasons to use a tax haven for some companies, but in the future these will be more scrutinized both by tax inspectors and media. Internet and search engines have changed the media landscape and created transparency where there used to be secrecy. This also this is also important, of course, how politicians use our tax money, and tax interest groups playing an active role in many countries to expose corruption, which is one aspect we work a lot with, in the international taxpayers movement that we don't need. This is an American page. The Open the Books group in America is one of my favorite groups. They are trying to get every public expense there is in America, federal, state, and local, on a database, so that everybody can search it and expose how their local or national politicians are actually using the money. And they do a fantastic job. They sometimes are being followed and not, let's say, not much appreciated by some politicians. Now, let's have a quick look at the Panama Papers. They say it's an enormous journalistic achievement. I'm not sure it is a journalistic achievement, but it's certainly a big hacker achievement and a really big job to create this database. 140 politicians from more than 50 countries, and so on. And it's extremely easy to search. I mean, the database is super fast. I just did a search on Churchill. Okay, bang, there you have. It just comes up, all the connections. I did a search on Barnevik just for fun. They came up two hits. I also tried. A few of our politicians got nothing, fortunately. And what you get then, the next step, you click on one of those things, and you can get here the name of the shareholder, Wealth of Africa Company Limited, and his home address in London. Whether this is good journalism or not, I don't know. But anyway, this is how this works, and sometimes you get big spider-like networks coming out of this. So it's very easy for journalists to use this. And here is a list of the 10 banks that have created most of these companies. Now, the next question to me is then, what will the media do with all this access of information? And it's not only this, it's other databases as well. And a few years ago, I was at a debate at the Swedish journalist club, Publicistklubben. And a Finnish journalist was on the panel that talked about the role of journalism and how it was developing. And she was very envious of how the Swedish journalists were able to drive causes in the news and in the papers. And whereas in Finland, they were very restricted to more reporting facts and have a neutral standpoint in a more objective way. And with the wealth of easy information, declining resources for journalists, and at the same rate that the number of bloggers are increasing quickly. And what you read on internet might be actually determined by some kind of algorithm in the back that Google has, which pushes certain kind of stuff to you that you seem to be interested in. You wonder about the state of information and the future of journalism. And then bringing this back to the tax harmonization and tax evasion, it is natural that tax authorities within the EU, for instance, are trying to harmonize taxes. This might actually be contrary to the interest of the taxpayers. And one of the causes we are pushing in the international taxpayers movement is tax competition, which I think has led to lowering taxes and good circumstances for businesses in many countries. Tax evasion, I think, will decline because of increased transparency, like we've seen. Companies and persons will likely in the future think twice before making arrangements through Panama or other tax havens. If, as a bonus, some of the estimated 500 billion from the narcotics trade going into the banking system, especially maybe in New York, in various ways, if this can be traced and stopped, it will be good for humanity, it seems. There will in the future be more transparency, both on how taxes are collected and used or misused in the future, and also how companies are setting up their business. This is something we should welcome and hope that the media also will use prudence in how this information is used. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Staffan. Now I'd like to welcome our commentators to the floor. We have three commentators on this panel. We have Richard Zundrich. He speaks English like an American, and I cannot, it's difficult. Richard Zundrich, I don't know how to pronounce it. Anyway, Richard has a doctorate in law, but works as a financial advisor. He's also a long-standing board member of the Austrian Economic Center and the Hayek Institute. After Staffan, we will listen to Anders Idstedt, who is a serial entrepreneur. I didn't check that with you, but I know you call yourself that sometimes. Not least in Scantex Strategy Advisors. He's also the chairman of Svensk Tidskrift, a weekly journal of politics, economics, and culture, founded in 1911. That is, as I mentioned earlier, a co-organizer of this event. And Anders is also a tax expert. And last but not least, we have Nick Hubble, who writes the Free Market Roadshow newsletter, used to work for Money Week in the UK. And can I say in public what your next job is? He's going to be a trapeze artist in somewhere in Asia.
Yeah, Singapore.
Singapore, yeah. I think that's an interesting career. Anyway, all three of you, please come up on stage, and we'll start with, as I said, with Richard. Yeah, please give me an applause.
I think I'm going to start this like an AA meeting. My name is Richard Zundrich, and in all likelihood, I am a crook. As most of you in the audience are very likely crooks. The reason I'm very likely a crook is I worked for a very long time in banking, doing some of these wonderful things mentioned in the introduction. Optimizing taxes for individuals and companies. Now, I was and still am of the opinion that everything we did at the time was perfectly legal. The reason it was perfectly legal and just took, a little bit of thinking and a little bit of planning was that taxes are, both taxes and public policy and other things in most countries, are extremely different. The way countries are run, their tax systems, their social security systems are different, and I think rightfully so. However, countries have a tendency never to repeal laws, on the one hand. So you have tax law upon tax law upon tax law. Then you have countries doing treaties with each other who want to do trade, and they're called double taxation agreements, the idea being that you pay tax either in one country or in another country, but if you're good at this stuff, you can end up paying tax in neither country perfectly legally, which is what we did. And I am very proud of the fact that, the German taxpayer, did not get 5 billion in taxes from various high-level companies, thanks for a very clever scheme I thought up. Things are treated differently. Things can be capital in one country, can be loans in other countries, can be beneficial. I think also here in Sweden you benefited from Argentinian papers which were tax-free. You bought it at deep discounts, you were getting 30% interest rate. tax-free. This is all the stuff we did in the day and is still going on. And I remember a memorable cocktail party between the highest Austrian tax official and one of our tax lawyers that we used. And he went over to our tax lawyer and he said, you know, we know what you're doing. We're going to pass a law. And this route you're using to save taxes is not going to work anymore. And our professor, doctor, you know, we're very proud of titles in Austria. Looked the guy in the eye and said, well, then we'll just think of something new. And this is the way the world works. And in Austria, at least, it says in the tax code, the taxpayer has the right to use legally any means possible to reduce his tax burden. It's legally allowed. Now, we were speaking of the death tax and the wealth tax, and we said, you know, abolished in Austria in 2008. And this is just one of the examples of how these things work very strangely. You know, in Austria, we have land, and we have a very powerful constituency of the Conservative Party, which is the landowners and the farmers. So land is taxed at a very low rate, also when it's either when it's passed on and on an ongoing basis. And then we did have an inheritance and a wealth tax in Austria. And if you inherited a house for 1 million krona, you would pay 6% taxes. And if you inherited 1 million krona cash, you would pay, depending on your situation, up to 50% taxes. Now, at some point in time, somebody figured this out, went to the Austrian Constitutional Court and said, you know, that's not fair. My sister got the house, I got the cash, she's still got the house, half of my cash is gone. Therefore, this was declared unconstitutional. And therefore, Austria no longer has a wealth tax at the moment, replaced by a very weird capital gains tax, which now people are doing all kinds of things like mentioned with the debit notes and, you know, the value of the house is reduced by the right of my mother to live until 125 in that building, and all of these people can get very, very creative when they're trying to avoid taxes. Now, on the one hand, due to the differences in the tax codes and the cultural differences between countries, I believe there are and always should be differences in that. I don't believe that these things can be harmonized without, you know, having a global centralized, or either a global or a EU centralized government telling us to do everything, which you may have gathered I'm not really in favor of. The second thing, it is detrimental mainly to middle-income people and mid-sized companies. Big international companies can hire people like me and Rothschild and HSBC and whatever, and you can come up with all kinds of things to make it work. That is very expensive, so I would say if you want to really avoid tax, you know, you've got to have a certain amount of money, otherwise it's just not worth it. On the other hand, if you lower taxes in a country to a certain degree and you attract people to your country and companies to your country with lower tax rates, at a certain point it doesn't become worth it anymore to avoid taxes, and that's why you always see that tax income goes up when you lower taxes to a certain rate. And I guess I'll stop here before I'm hogging the floor.
Thank you. Thanks for those words. Anders, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks for introduction, Staffan. You said that the Swedish death tax was like abolished right out of the blue in 2004, and I must perhaps tell you a little bit more about that, because at that time I was the campaign manager for the campaign against the death tax in Sweden, and it was a little bit like it was quite a big campaign. And it was a little bit like you described in Austria. In Sweden, we have different taxes on if an individual person, or it was the discussion how to save small family business, how to make the transfer between generations. And then they had the discussion, should we have capital, working capital, they were talking about active capital in small companies. Should that be free from the inheritance tax or not? And they have a big state committee working for 2-3 years about that. Should we exempt family business from the inheritance tax? And eventually this group didn't really find any solution, and then the politicians found the solutions. It's more fair if everyone pays the same level, 0, than we exempt some groups. And we have exactly the same discussion now in Germany. They have the Constitution Court in Karlsruhe has found that the exemption for family business in Germany is unconstitutional. And I hope they will have find the same solution as in Sweden. We have a 0 level. Our editor-in-chief in Svensk Tidskrift, Amanda Wollstad, and I wrote a book last year about the history of how the Swedish death tax got away in 2004. You can find that on bookstores. I will start perhaps to have a discussion with you. I thought we should have the same opinion, but actually I don't have at all. I think you're wrong about how big multinational corporation works, because I think, first of all, the whole discussion when you talk about multinational corporation and not paying their fair share and so, it's corporate taxes. How big is corporate taxes in the total? You think it's like in the industrial world, it's like 5% of the total tax revenues. It's 5%. The rest is consumption taxes and income taxes. We have a big debate, the G20 meetings, G8, tax protesters, campaigners and so on are protesting. It's about 5% of the taxes. Corporate income tax is a more important revenue in developing world, and then that's a special problem that should we work about how to tax oil production and so on, and perhaps countries in Africa should develop their tax services and so. But that has nothing to do with Google or Amazon or Facebook or H&M paying their taxes. In Sweden, they try to hang out the H&M stores because their business in Bangladesh doesn't pay any corporate income tax in Bangladesh. But they have no business in Bangladesh. They have procurement. They buy their clothes. They create a lot of values, a lot of jobs. A lot of people works for industry that produce clothes for H&M, and they pay taxes. But why should H&M pay corporate income tax only for procurement? And the same, I think, about Google making business in UK. They have sales force selling services, but they're not producing the service in UK. It's a sales force. And if you try to shift the whole tax landscape, that's what's making now this base erosion, profit shifting, the EU project, ATA, anti-tax avoidance package, and UN is working with. If you shift the whole landscape only for 5% of the total tax revenue, everything else will also change. Because businesses have to if you have to follow this system, then you have to move your headquarters, you have to move your research, you have to move your IP portfolio and so on. And the only winners in this discussion will probably be the the politicians in bigger countries with more people, and they will move everything. And that could in short term perhaps be a good idea for France or UK and so on, because small countries like Sweden will be a loser because we have to move our export industry to France and so on to make deductions also in France. But I think the big loser, that's the free market, because you should have the specialization and trade and so on. If you can't do cross-border business, then and I think all those projects like BEPS and ATA and so on, they will put an obstacle on free trade. And of course, there will always people who do this treaty business and using and so on. You have to work on those kind of treaties. But if you shift the whole landscape, that's the business today. They say the fair share is that corporations should pay taxes where the sales are. Then you have to also move the whole corporations to where the sales are. And then you can forget about what Adam Smith told us and Ricard and so on, everything about specialization. I think all those politicians who read Bastiat, because they see only this 5%, the tax avoidance that the UN calculated, big corporation tax avoidance could be like maximum 14% globally and then it's 14% of 5%. So this whole discussion about this, of course, it's a lot of debate and protesters and so on. But if you shift the whole tax lanes because of that.
We're talking about two different things
Yeah.
here that I referred to, and it was the tax haven discussion. Of course, we agree that I say, corporations, I am a firm believer that everything should, if possible, only be taxed once at a certain level. And I mean, ideally, you would have, no corporate tax, and you would tax it someplace, and it's a big discussion where and when that should be taxed, be it on the labor or on the consumption tax or land taxes or whatever. I'm not going to get into that, but it should only be taxed once. The second thing, and this is important, and it was touched upon in the key speech, the so-called tax havens are not only havens for tax purposes, they've only been called for that. There are perfectly legitimate reasons to keep your money someplace else than the country you live. I'm thinking of the poor Russians and Venezuelans and all kind of other countries in the world whose currencies have just massively devalued, and they've lost money. They like to keep a certain amount in dollars or Swiss francs or krona or whatever outside of the country. That is one reason. Another reason is, totalitarian governments that come after your money, and you want to be safe. I mean, for years and years and years after World War II, Austrians kept their money in Switzerland, not because they wanted to save taxes on their money in Switzerland, but the Russians were on the border and could walk in any minute. So, you always had a little bit. And then, finally, somebody came after the money in Switzerland. So that's the general thing. I mean, they're going after poor Emma Watson. Emma Watson? Harry Potter, she does spells and so on. She's in the Panama Papers. Being in the Panama Papers does not per se mean you have done anything illegal. She happens to be a famous actress who doesn't necessarily want everybody to know what she's doing. Leave her alone. Okay, so, but to get to this point, what tax havens and these jurisdictions do is facilitate the transfer of capital worldwide from one place to another when it is not possible directly. And these are pools of money there that can be used and are very beneficial. And if we dry them up, we will really hurt world trade. So just that was
And
my
going back to
interjection.
Bastiat, what you see
Yeah.
and what you don't see, I think also we all benefit from the institutional, the competition between different jurisdictions and different tax levels and so on. So probably the taxes would be much higher if there weren't any tax havens. So
Yeah.
definitely. So I will give my own example from one of our business, what will happen now in the European Union. We have an internet sales company where we have a robot that sell used internet domains. We're actually the biggest in the world selling used Swedish domains names. And we sell them all over the world globally. And we have to pay VAT on that sales. And then the politicians in Brussels thought out that they should make this simpler, so they introduced the mini one-stop shop, they call it. That's the European online sales systems. And it's so complicated, so we actually put up a robot to stop customers from Europe. So we say, if private customers coming to our business, we say, unfortunately, since 2 years, we have this a simplified VAT system for European companies. Unfortunately, we can't sell to you. You can move to Norway, or you can move to South Africa or something like that. But so we sell domain names to all over the world, and the private persons in all over the world and Sweden, but not in European Union. And that's the new European system. And I think now I read yesterday that we introduce this system not only to online sales, but also to web sales on small products and so on also. So, and that's they try to. You have in the US, they have this extraterritorial tax system where you have to pay tax in the US everywhere in the world. And the European politicians now want to introduce the same thing in Europe. So you have to pay VAT. As a Swede, you have to pay Swedish VAT if you go to Germany and so on. And you probably have to keep your passport with you and so on. And so on the one side, you have politicians talking about free trade and how we should open up markets. On the other side, you have the tax people stopping the same, blocking and putting up more obstacles to free trade. And I think that's the other side of this discussion about the tax landscape.
You're done?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Sorry. I'm with it hurts my business.
Yeah. No, okay. I just wanted to make sure that you're finished. Thank you so much for that. Now I'm going to give the floor to Nick, who's going to give his comments.
Sounds good. 10 minutes still?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so thanks for having me. Thanks for learning English, everyone. This would be a disaster if you didn't speak English. A very long conference for both of us. My accent is Australian, but I grew up in Germany, England, Ireland, Scotland, Austria, and Australia. So I'm practically European for you. Most of the reason for the moving around was tax competition, funnily enough. We moved around for my dad's job, and that company moved around for tax competition, and since then for tax competition itself for both of my parents, who decided to live on opposite sides of the world to avoid each other. And actually, I grew up playing bandy as a kid with my neighbour, so I'm practically Swedish as well for you. So our topic is taxes and death, or death and taxes, and I've got a really big problem with that topic, because taxes are the symptom. Taxes are what you get after government spending. If you try and solve taxes by itself, you're just going to be left with inflation or debt, which is effectively just a tax as well. So if you want to have lower taxes, you have to go for spending, government spending first. Australia, where I lived for the last 13 years, is a good example of that. In the 90s, they cut spending first and then taxes followed. So what I would like to do is avoid the topic a little bit, or address it indirectly, and talk about the justification for government spending. A lot of people, I'm guessing people at this institute, have published things like wasteful government spending, publications showing how ridiculous the EU or the Swedish government can be in what it spends. And that's the type of thing that I like to hear about. But for the last few years, I've actually slowly gotten more and more extreme about this. Just what should the government be spending money on? That's one of the big questions that comes up. And I like to think of myself now as a consistent libertarian, which means I apply the same ideas to everything. And the result of that is that I'm pretty much an anarchist. I think the government should do absolutely nothing, and that would solve the problem of taxes itself too. Now, that sounds outrageous, and I'm not coming at it from an ideological angle. So what I'm going to try and do for you is start you off on the journey to being a consistent libertarian, to becoming an anarchist. So what's the justification for government spending? What is it that they need to provide us with? What's the economic term for it? Come on, you must know. Public goods, right? The government has to provide public goods. Justice is one example of them. What are some other public goods that only the government can provide for us? National defense, what else? What are things that only the government will do?
Agricultural subsidies.
Protection of private, yeah. So the typical examples, actually we should start with the first example of a public good. If you read Adam Smith, he uses lighthouses as his example of something that only the government can provide. Because how does a lighthouse make money? Who would build a lighthouse? Who would pay for that? How would a lighthouse charge its clients? If one of the clients decided not to pay the lighthouse fee, the lighthouse can't just turn the light off because all the other ships are stuffed, right? So the lighthouse is a perfect example of all the problems that the government can fix. Now in the 20s, a guy called Ronald Coase, who went on to win the Nobel Prize, decided to research the history of lighthouses. And he found they were privately run, privately built, quite profitable, and the government took them over because they were making money off the public safety. So, and I mean, hundreds of years, we had read about lighthouses being the public good that all economists used as their example, and they got it wrong. So lighthouses, the private sector can do it pretty well, it turns out, especially these days. Next example, schools. So especially primary schools, right? The poor can't afford private schooling. There's no way that poor people can pay for these beautiful private schools that some of us were lucky enough to go to. Well, this guy called James Tooley, he was an expert on building schools in developing countries. And one day he left this brand new school that the United Nations or the EU had paid for in India, and he decided to go for a walk into a slum. And he came across a private school in a tin shed with a sewage canal running down the middle of it. And the teacher was just a mother of one of the children. And he said, "What are you doing? We've got a free school with famous school teachers just up the road. It's free. It's a beautiful building. They have beautiful new toilets. It's safe. They get all these wonderful benefits." And the mum said, "But they don't learn there. The teachers hate us. They don't respect us. The results are terrible. They come home. We speak better English than they do." So I decided to teach my child myself. And then my neighbor said, "Well, your child is learning English better than my child at the school. So would you mind teaching my child?" And she says, "Yes, but for a fee." And it snowballed from there. And all of a sudden you had a big for-profit private school in a slum in India. So this changed James Tooley's thinking, and he went out looking for similar schools all around the world. And he found hundreds of them. In fact, he now estimates between 80 and 60% of children in slums in some sub-Saharan Africa, in India, in China, it's especially high, are privately educated, usually in for-profit schools. And they almost always do better than the local government school on exam results, on the national exam results. So schools are out. Lighthouses, schools, private sector does better. Roads. Roads are my favorite example. So I went to a speech by a guy called Walter Block in Australia. I'm timing myself to make sure I don't go over. I'm not texting my friends. He gave a speech about who would build the roads. Who would build the roads if the government didn't do it? And there was a guy sitting next to me, and he kept on shaking his head and scoffing, and he was really annoyed with this guy. And the speech is really good. You can watch it online for free at YouTube. Just Google who would build the roads. And so at the end of the speech, I introduced myself to Buddy, and Buddy builds roads for a living. I said, "That's why you didn't like the speech, because you work for the government." And he said, No, I build roads." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, there's all these places in Australia where the government roads either won't be built or they're not sufficient for the use, for example, in the mines or the cattle trucks that are huge and heavy. So I build roads for these people, these private companies, and they have to be better than the government roads, or they have to be different to the government roads." And he explained to me how that system works. So it turns out that the speech was wrong by Walter Block. There's actually many different ways of doing it that Walter Block hasn't thought of. So the academic, again, got it wrong, at least when it comes to Australia. And my friend Buddy builds roads. So that's roads out. The legal system. Legal system's an excellent example, providing justice. Now, where does the British legal system come from? It comes from a private, non-government system that existed right around the Mediterranean and up to Britain. It's based on maritime law, maritime trade law. And it turns out that people didn't trust governments, and that's why they went to this private system. And it worked quite well, and then eventually the British government took it over, because governments like taking over things that work, right? So the justice system, at least what the British system is based on, was privately run, privately enforced. The other part of justice is, of course, police forces, the enforcement of this justice. I didn't know this, but apparently Georgia has recently privatized its police force because the government police force was too corrupt. So now private companies provide the law enforcement in Georgia. I don't know anything about that. I don't even know if it's true, to be honest, but Barbara Kolm, the president of the Austrian Economic Center, was telling me about it. Apparently it's working quite well, but I haven't had time to research that. So maybe even police is also better provided by the private sector. Water, I learnt this on the roadshow. Tenerife has privatized water completely, because all they need to do is drill sideways into the mountain that they all live on, and water comes out the tunnel. The government's trying to take it over because it's working too well. Everybody has access to their own water, so the government can't control people and bill people, and it's a problem for the government that things are working too well. Money. Money is another good one. How many different note-issuing banks are there in the United Kingdom? How many different names of banks are on banknotes in the United Kingdom? It's close to 10, I think. There's four in Scotland. Royal Bank of Scotland, Clydesdale Bank, Bank of Scotland, and the Bank of England. There's one in Isle of Man, and there's one in Isle of Wight, and there's 3 in Northern Ireland. Why? Because money used to be provided by the private sector, not by the government. The government took it over because it worked too well. So, and there's lots of wonderful information about the free banking system, where banks could issue as much money as they wanted. They could create as much money as they wanted. And they were held accountable by things like bank runs. It worked very well, apparently. That's what the history says. It might still work today. I suppose Bitcoin might test us. So those are some of my examples. I could keep going for you, but it's sort of pointless. What I'm trying to do is get you thinking, get you on the journey to becoming a consistent libertarian. So my last question to you is, how many examples do you need before you start to realize that just because I can't tell you how the private sector would do something, that doesn't mean the private sector couldn't do it better? So for example, someone in North Korea might say, what do you mean no one organizes the supermarket? And that's silly to us, but to them, they can't imagine it. So if I was in North Korea and I couldn't explain to you how supermarkets work, would that mean that I'm wrong, that the private sector can do a better job than the government? No. There is something about the private sector that means it inherently does better on, I think, literally everything. What those things are, we can debate about all the time, but the examples I've just given you prove that at least on those examples, the private sector does do better. And they're the type of things that people say are public goods. So how many examples do you need before you start to see this principle? I've got another 15 seconds. One of the things you should focus on if you start to believe what I do is that you shouldn't be trying to change the government, you should be trying to create alternatives. You should be looking at things like Bitcoin. You should be looking at things like mediation instead of going to the court system, the privatized court system. There's lots of opportunities like that. Compete with the government, don't try and change it. Thank you.
Exit rather than voice.
Exit rather than
Voice in the setup of how to change a dysfunctional organization. Yeah, yeah. Very interesting. Thank you very much. You made me think a lot. Does any of the speakers want to comment on any of the other speakers first? Yeah, Anders, go ahead.
I will give Nick one example of a privatized court in Sweden. If we have a conflict between a domain buyer, like we sell domain coca-cola.se, that's not a court issue. It's a privatized solution system we have here. Organized private, yeah, and it works really good. And all countries, we get a lot of lawyers from France and so on, and try to go to court here against us. And we just say it's a privatized solution system, works very well. Here is the web address. Good luck.
Also with the police, the security companies are taking over more and more, and fulfilling the police functions in all societies and in our society.
If you get one anarchist in a room, all the other ones pop out of nowhere. They know it's safe and you won't throw anything at us. So.
Yeah.
And one on roads, as you well know, as I think you know, but make sure everyone else does, it's incredibly easy now to sell the roads and privatize every single road. It's electronically trivial. And then you would pay your road bill monthly like you pay your gas bill. And there would be signs by the road raising the price when congestion is high, and we wouldn't have to build any more roads.
On roads,
Perfect.
I have a good friend from Guatemala. He told me the example how they're building a road that cost $10 million to build, and they're getting foreign support for it. And it was going through various stages, and by the time the Americans came to pay for it, it was $65 million. And the Americans were very happy. They spent $65 million on a good road in Guatemala, and everybody in between, down to the 10 million, were also very happy.
50% of the Swedish roads are private. But the problem with the government is they are not building only roads, they build those bridges to nowhere. And that's also a problem with government spending.
Yes.
I think we have a bad example in Sweden. I'm talking about foreign aid. And we have decided politically that we are going to spend 1% of our GNP every year in foreign aid, regardless of whether the aid is needed and how it's going to be used. And this has led to more and more what they call budget aid, which means we're shipping the money straight into the state budget in all these countries where they are used for anything, and in eventually maybe even for arms.
And Swiss bank accounts.
And maybe Swiss bank accounts, yes. We have one of our members in Ghana, they are have an example. They have protested against something like $125 million came in to start jobs, and when the money came out for the projects at the other end, all the money was gone, so the money was sort of lost. And they've attacked this openly, and they're now being threatened in the street. People come up and tell to them, "I know where you live," and you know, yeah, it's can be dangerous also to work for transparency.
Yeah, I just have one thing to add to my speech, and something that is very dangerous currently, and that is when people do their planning and tax planning and so on for the future, they should be able to count on these things working and being legal according to the system. What has been happening in recent years is that governments have not only changed the laws when they didn't work something, they have begun to change all of these rules retroactively. And they have messed up international mergers by changing the rules. They have messed up. You have to, at least if you believe that there has to be a law, which some people don't, but you have to be able to plan ahead of time. It messes up the market totally if governments and coercive trans-government organizations end up changing the rules retroactively, and that is a terrible trend that we have to watch out for.
May I ask you, you made me think, Nick, of course, and I just want to, one part of free market is competition, and one consequence of competition is creative destruction. It can be dirty, chaotic. It's supposed to be dirty and chaotic, but that's for firms. But do we really want the justice system to be dirty and chaotic?
Yep, we do. Definitely. So, I mean, it wasn't, first of all, historically. It wasn't dirty and chaotic when it was fully privatised legal system around the Mediterranean up to the UK, because the governments weren't involved. In fact, the only dirty part of it was when the governments tried to get involved, because they wanted a monopoly to be able to control the trade and the maritime issues. But, I mean, I think it would be surprising if the private sector justice system was worse than the government provided one. And also, the incentive is to provide what the consumer of the justice system wants. Right? So if we agree and we're clear between each other, then there's no reason to be dirty justice and competitive. But if we agree on something, we have a contract and there's a judge, and the judge does something dirty and dishonest, then we just go to someone else for the next one. So what's the incentive? It's to not be dirty and unjust. So all the incentives, I mean, you can accuse, well, put it this way, are supermarkets dirty? No. Privatized roads dirty? They tend to be significantly less dirty than the government-provided ones. So, you know, the anarchist system is never perfect. It's only ever better. And it's almost always better.
Thank you very much. Now it's time for questions from the audience. You guys are going to be joining us. So there's a guy running around with the mic. Please state your name and any affiliation, if relevant.
Paula Röttorp. And since I'm a lawyer, of course, I'll ask about the private courts. De facto, all big commercial transactions in Sweden is handled through arbitration and not court, because we don't trust courts.
How's the arbitrator selected?
By the parties. Normally, they choose one party each, and then they choose the arbitrator.
I'm running out of room for my examples.
But there are, and the advantages of this is that it's quicker. It's slightly more expensive normally, but not necessarily. And of course it is what the parties want it to be, i.e. confidential. On the other hand, it means that the rest of us do not have access to the cases. So we don't know what the case law actually says. So the advantage of a court and the advantage of a uniform legal system is, of course, the ability for everyone to actually read and get the information. When it's only arbitrators, of course they have, many of them serve in many arbitrational tribunals, but you still have a lack of certainty. due to confidentiality. And of course, the parties will always choose confidentiality. No one wants to have the dirt out in the open.
That's not necessarily true. If their customers value transparency in contracts, for example, if it was a lawyer, for example, you would only go to a lawyer who is transparent in all of their dealings, right? And they would only be contracted to an arbitrator who enforces that transparency. Because that's why anyone does anything in a free market, is to satisfy their customers. They're serving their customers. And if part of serving your customer is transparency in your agreements, then an arbitrator could provide that in a free market system. I don't know how the Swedish system
In
is
theory,
working.
they could, but why would they? Because
Because
no
they're
one wants.
serving their customers by doing so. So, for example, I would
theory.
not have your legal services provided to me without me knowing every part of your dealings with your arbitrator.
Yeah, but you don't want everyone else to know it.
No, but I as the customer
Yes.
of your legal service, or say you're a supermarket, I as a customer of your supermarket services, grocery store services, could only decide to only go to your shop if you were committed to someone who enforces transparency. So
Yes.
all these,
But typically, it's against your interest because you don't want to have your own case published.
but the customer wants to have. I'm a customer of
I think you're missing each other here.
yeah. So I confused you because you're a lawyer. So
Well, I think we're all
Okay, fine.
confused by the confusion, and let's see if there's any other questions. Yes. Please state your name.
Nilani Ljunggren de Silva. I'm from Stockholm University and I'm a researcher. This question is to you. And you were talking about you're talking about privatization, and you were talking about privatization is better than the government, and then why? And then it's quite like neoliberal view, and. So how do you explain that 2008 when we had this problem because the government
Yep.
was kept aside, and how do you explain that?
So how do you describe what happened in 2008? What went wrong? How would you describe it? Where did things go wrong? They went wrong in the housing market?
They went wrong everywhere. It affected maybe not so much in Sweden, but
Yep.
the rest of the world.
So, but what were the principal places that things went wrong when housing and
Housing,
banking?
Banking.
So they're
Please,
the two.
please let him answer so we can.
They're the two areas, right? So the price of housing and banking is heavily influenced by the interest rate, which is controlled by the central bank, which is effectively a government institution. So again, you've just got government. If the government manipulates the price of oranges, you'd expect a shortage or a surplus in the orange market. The government controlled the price of debt. We got a surplus of debt and a shortage of housing, and the whole thing went out of whack. It's exactly what you would expect from any government intervention.
Oh, sorry. My name is Per Bretham. I'm a commercial lawyer and IP lawyer. Not an economist, though, so I might be a bit off here. You said about the tax harmonization. I agree with you on that. But the same rationale, does that go for, say, what is things that are not taxes, but like customs and tariffs and other things, or is harmonization also a bad thing there, or a good thing? I mean, trying to lower tariffs and customs.
Well, on trade and customs, we of course are for the idea that there is as much of that as possible. So I would harmonize them at zero, if possible. Usually there's a difference because a tax is something that you levy in your own country, whereas you also levy, of course, your tariffs on the way in, but that changes your price of goods. So usually countries will deal directly with each other, either two countries doing a trade agreement, a EU-wide trade agreement to allow free trade in Europe, or now the huge discussion that we're having between, trade agreement between the EU and the US, or the US and Asia. Different things, in my opinion. And if you're talking about a certain American presidential candidate advocating the higher tariff system to save jobs or keep them in the country. It very simply results in higher prices of those goods that the tariff is run on, because you can do that and have your iPhone made in China. And Mr. Trump, I'm not wearing it today. I have a Trump signature shirt by the guy. It says "Made in China."
Okay, if there are no other questions, I think we should thank this panel with a round of applause.